without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Mirella Manfredi from the University of Zurich, who is our first speaker. Mirella earned her Ph.D. in Cognitive Neuroscience from the University of Milan. And then after that, she has been pretty much everywhere at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, at San Diego in California, and now has received a SNSF starting grant from the government of Switzerland. She's now an assistant professor at the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Psychotherapy at the University of Zurich, and she leads the Neurodiversity and Cognition Lab. Her research, about which we're going to be hearing in a minute, focuses on the neurocognitive foundations of humor, and particularly on how autistic and neurotypical adolescents and adults process humor and positive information. And when I looked up her Google Scholar page, because I wanted to summarize it, I was like, it gave me a headache because she's got already more than 50 publications, an H index of 15, which for a young scholar is astonishing. And on top of that, she has published a delightful book that I strongly recommend. And if you don't speak Italian, I strongly recommend that you learn Italian in order to be able to read this book, because it's worth it. So having said this, without further ado, Mirella, go for it.
Thank you very much, Sal, for this very nice presentation. It's really an honor to be here today and, of course, to have this opportunity to share some of our work about the neuroscience of humor. So in this talk, I would like to offer you, two perspectives on neuroscience of humor. So first of all, I will focus on the cognitive and the neural mechanism underlying humor processing. But second, I will also present an ongoing project on humor and neurodiversity that, as Sal mentioned, has been granted last year by the Swiss National Foundation. But before moving to research, let me start with the definition of humor. So, according to Martin and Ford, humor is a broad and a multifaceted term that represents everything people say or do that others perceive as funny and that tends to make them laugh, as well as the mental process that occurs in both situations. So in my opinion, this definition captures very well the dual nature of humor because it highlights that humor is both a social behavior, but it's also a very complex mental process. So humor is a universal phenomenon that characterizes human experience from the very beginning. Indeed, infants laugh long before they can speak, and laughter, as we know, if we had experience with young children, is one of the earliest forms of social connection, as we can also appreciate in this video. However, laughter is not a uniquely human phenomenon. Primatologists have found that chimpanzees, for example, and also other apes, show a form of laughter. In chimpanzees and also in humor, laughter is a signal that tells the other individuals, I want to continue play with you. And if we think about that, it's actually, this meaning hasn't changed so much for us. Indeed, when we interact and laugh with someone, we communicate exactly that. So safety, play, and affiliation. From an evolutionary point of view, humor might also have acted as a signal of mental fitness. So according to Geoffrey Mill, the ability to produce humor requires intelligence, creativity, and flexibility. These are cognitive traits that would be an advantage for both attracting and also bonding with others. In the past, many theories have tried to conceptualize humor and to explain the mechanism underlying humor. Here, I will focus on a particular theory, very important theory for cognitive science, that is incongruity resolution theory by Salz. According to this theory, humor emerges when the punchline violates our expectation in a way that we can successfully reinterpret. If the incongruity can be cognitively resolved, the joke indeed is perceived as funny. So let's see together this example taken by Canal and colleagues. In this work, these authors recorded the EEG while they present several jokes, such as this one. A young couple wakes up in the middle of the night because the firstborn is crying. And she says, "Dear, I get up. The baby never stops. Perhaps it's time I change him." And he replied, "Well done, calm him down." Well, in this case, of course, we won't laugh because what the partner says is absolutely in line with our expectations. But if the partner would have said, "Well done, choose another one," in this case, actually, the word change becomes the incongruity element that, when integrated to the context, produces an amusement reaction. Of course, we have to get the humor, we have to get the meaning, and we should be able to reintegrate the meaning into the context. Otherwise, we are just puzzled and we can actually appreciate the humor. So according to this theory, humor includes two phases. The first phase includes the comprehension, including the detection of an incongruity, and then its resolution and the appreciation. So at this point, we might ask what happens in the brain when we get a joke. A previous study used the fMRI to unveil which are the brain areas that might be involved in humor. And I will briefly present this study by Moran and colleagues, where they use popular television sitcoms as humorous stimuli. The aim of this work was to indeed dissociate these two phases of humor, so humor detection and humor appreciation. And they found that humor comprehension was associated with the activation of the left inferior frontal gyrus of the left posterior middle temporal cortex, while the appreciation of humor was associated with insular cortex and the amygdala, that are regions more associated with the emotion processing. One of the main focus of our research is to highlight the different neurocognitive that are engaged in different types of humor. And we start this research with focusing on a special types of humor called slapstick humor. So when we think about slapstick humor, one of the first images that comes to mind is Tom and Jerry scenes. So these scenes have entertained generations of children around the world, and the appeal of the slapstick is usually very immediate and universal. Indeed, it relies on visual exaggeration, physical misfortune, and absurdity. But we notice that despite its prominence in cultural fields such as comics, for example, old movies, and cartoons, the scientific study of slapstick humor has been relatively limited. So we start our investigation trying to unveil the neurocognitive mechanisms that are involved in slapstick humor. And in the very first study, we wanted to verify the hypothesis that the victim facial expression of a misfortune is actually the key perceptual element that triggers an amusement reaction in the observers of a misfortunate situation. To test this hypothesis, we perform an EEG study in which we use this technique, the electroencephalography, that measures the electrical activity of a large population of neurons in the brain with the use of electrodes placed on the scalp. This is a non-invasive technique that also allows a highly precise measurement of the brain factor with a very highly temporal resolution that is very adapted to detect different phases that characterize the humor processing. So in the first study, we present pictures depicting males and females of different numbers and situations involved in different misfortune situations. And in particular, we analyzed three categories. In the affective pictures, we presented a victim of a misfortunate situation displaying a painful or angry expression. In the comic pictures, the victim of the misfortunate situation showed this funny and bewildered expression. And finally, as a control, we also presented pictures of people involved in a misfortunate situation where actually the facial expression was not visible. So this was our control because in this case, the participant had no clue about the information, the affective information that characterized this type of misfortunate situation. And our results show that the comic pictures elicited the N200 component, that is a very early component of our brain that could reflect the first identification of the comic element. And it's also be the evidence of this compelling and automatic response that characterizes our reaction when we, for example, observe someone falling down, for example. Regarding the no face condition, we found an M400 response. This is another component of our brain that is usually associated with incongruity detection or semantic violation. So in this case, our result could reflect the extra effort needed to comprehend the nature of the situation because actually the affective element in this case was not visible. So probably the participant struggled to try to understand what type of misfortunate situation was depicted in this case. In the second study, we wanted to go further and to further confirm what we found. So the fact that the facial expression is indeed an important element for triggering an amusement reaction. And since previous studies show that an area of our brain, the superior temporal gyrus, is involved in facial expression perception, we hypothesized that the transcranial direct current stimulation, the TDCS, on this area would have modulated the ability to recognize the facial expression with also an effect on understanding and appreciating the facial expression involved in a misfortunate situation. So to test this hypothesis, we presented the same pictures, the same paradigm that we present in the ERP studies, while stimulating this area of the brain. And we observed that the stimulation of this area improved specifically the mean reaction time for comic stimuli. So we conclude that, of course, this study confirmed that the superior temporal gyrus is involved in facial expression recognition, but it also confirmed that the appreciation that could also be involved in the appreciation of the comic element, meaning the facial expression of a misfortunate situation. So to summarize, this first piece of data supports the hypothesis that the facial expression of the victim of a misfortune might act as a specific trigger for the amusement feeling that observers usually experience when, for example, someone falls down. So building on these findings, we turn to children and we ask a developmental question. So when and how does the ability to recognize slapstick humor emerge in children? And what cognitive and the neural process support this ability? In particular, we want to examine the developmental trajectory of slapstick humor and facial recognition in order to determine how and when these two abilities start to interact in early life. To this aim, we tested 4 to 5 years old children using the electroencephalography while performing 2 tasks. A facial emotion recognition task. It was like a classical paradigm where we just ask the children to say whether these 2 facial expressions that we show were similar or different. And a humor recognition task where we present, again, different type of slapstick humor, and the children had just to decide whether these pictures were funny or not. Regarding the results, we observe a greater negativity response in the N170 time window. That is a classical ERP component associated with the facial expression recognition in response to the congruent trials as compared to the incongruent one, revealing actually that the children were able to differentiate facial expression that were similar from the one that were different. And we also observed a P300 component that is usually associated with an increased attentional resources in response to the incongruent pictures as compared to the congruent one. So in this case, probably the children needed an extra effort to differentiate these two facial expressions. And regarding the humor task, we also found here a greater N170 response to the humorous condition as compared to the non-humorous one. And if you remember the previous study on adults, we found actually an N200 component. So actually, again, an early component. So probably also in this case, this early component might reflect the first identification of the comic element. So very strongly associated with the processing of the facial expression of the victim. We also found a late positivity response that in other studies has been also associated with the appreciation phase, so with the amusement phase. We also found a positive correlation between the performance in the two tasks and also between the N170 response in the emotion recognition task, so the index of facial expression recognition, and with the late positivity amplitude of the humor tasks. So this suggests that the early processing of emotional facial expressions reflecting in the N170 component is positively correlated with the appreciation of the humor situation depicting the comic condition that is reflecting in the late positivity component. So in conclusion, this correlation might support our hypothesis of a close association between the processing of slapstick humor and the processing of facial expression in 4 to 5 years old children. In the next studies, we asked whether the brain responses to slapstick humor was similar to or different from that elicited by other types of humor, such as theory mind humor, for example, that is the ability to understand the mental states of other people. Previous investigation used, for example, in this case, fMRI, suggests that the processing of theory mind humor involved the recruitment of areas that are typically involved into theory mind processing, such as the right inferior frontal gyrus, left superior temporal gyrus, and left middle temporal gyrus. In one study, we hypothesized that the application of the TDCS, or the transcranial direct current stimulation, on two areas that are involved in the theory of mind, such as the medial prefrontal cortex and the right temporal parietal junction, would improve the humor perception during the observation of humorous scenes that require theory of mind. So in this case, we use comic strips. In one condition, the comic strips contain represent a type of theory of mind humor, so required theory of mind abilities to be understood. This is the second one. And the first one, this represents a type of comic strip that involved slapstick humor. So in this case, no theory of mind were involved or much less. We also present two control conditions, congruent strips and incongruent strips. So in this case, these strips were just semantically congruent and these were semantically incongruent. Regarding the results, we found that the stimulation of the middle prefrontal cortex led the participant to rate funny cartoons as funnier compared to when the area was not stimulated. So we conclude that the middle prefrontal cortex stimulation improved the ability to identify non-humorous incongruent element, but also to recognize the humorous component of a scene. So we can conclude that actually theory of mind required the involvement of areas involved in the theory of mind processing. That is also in line with the previous fMRI studies. We replicate this study with an ERP study. So we presented the same visual narrative strips, the same comic strips. And in this case, we found that both the humorous comic strips, so both the slapstick one and the Tom humor one, elicited the greater N400 response. So if you remember, I mentioned that the N400 response is an ERP component associated with the semantic violation and incongruity detection. So in this case, this response might reflect the first step of humor comprehension, that is, according to incongruity resolution theory, is the incongruity detection. We also found a positive that the TOM humorous strips, so the strip that required the theory mind, elicited the frontal late positivity response, probably reflecting the active deployment of theory mind abilities such as perspective taking and empathy, that of course are very important for the resolution and the interpretation of this type of humor. In addition, we also find a positive correlation between the late positivity response and the individual empathy scores, as well as the amusement ratings. So, in conclusion, these studies highlighted the complexity of the neurocognitive processes involved in humor processing that might vary depending on the type of humor presented. In addition, these studies clearly indicate that the more complex form of humor requires the support of specific cognitive abilities such as theory of mind in order to be fully understood and appreciated. So I will now move to briefly present my project that has been granted by the SNF last year about humor and neurodiversity. So the title is Humor in Adolescence on the Autism Spectrum, a Window into Cognition and a Tool for Well-Being. So as we know, humor is a universal phenomenon. However, not all the individuals perceive humor in the same way. Previous literature reports that in individuals on the autism spectrum, the ability to use or even to recognize humor appears altered, although the evidence in the literature doesn't appear to be conclusive. So, for example, previous studies show that autistic people usually show lower comprehension and appreciation for different types of humor tasks, such as nonsense jokes, incongruity resolution jokes, and other studies, such as the one of Samson colleagues, showed that actually individuals on the autism spectrum were able to recognize and appreciate the incongruity resolution humor as compared to the nonsense one, for example. It was also observed that usually autistic participants made more mistakes in identified jokes as compared to control, and they also struggle when they have to recognize the jokes as compared to a story, for example. However, what we noticed before starting our project was that usually the material used in this type of studies were, of course, pre-selected by non-autistic researchers. We also noticed from the literature that although humor is actually a strength in autism, is actually underexplored and also underused in the clinical practice. We also observed that usually interventions that used humor try to normalize humor in individuals on the autism spectrum instead of valorizing and highlighting a specific type of humor that is specific of these individuals. So we really thought that a new and a different perspective on humor in autism was needed. And also, since in recent years, the experimental investigations have revealed the complexity of the neuroplastic processing underlying the cognition in individuals on the autism spectrum, this actually brought to the birth of a new movement called the neurodiversity paradigm that actually considers autism as a form of a variation within a diversity of mind. So this is far from the deficit conception of autism. And in our project, we embrace this perspective. And in particular, we include a participatory research method. This means that we have an advisory group that includes people on the autism spectrum that are involved in our project from the beginning. So they are at the moment, for example, they are helping us with building the stimuli of our research, because we want to be sure that the stimuli that we use are respectful and are also well understood by these individuals. We also highlighted the heterogeneity of the humor responses, and to do that, we actually employ a dimensional approach. This means that we will perform correlations between each participant autistic trait and their response, also regardless of the diagnosis, even though we, of course, also include the diagnosis. And finally, we will also implement a tailor-made humor program that is not actually a training, but it's a program. This means that we want to valorize and strengthen the individuals on the autism spectrum own sense of humor. So this project has two main goals. So first of all, we want to discover how and why and for what individuals on the autism spectrum process humor, and whether a humor-based training program might improve the well-being in these individuals. The target population of this research project is the adolescents of the autism spectrum, because they are more likely to experience a social exclusion and bullying. And we believe that this project might have, in the end, a positive effect on their well-being. And we will also employ a multi-method approach. So this means that we will assess the cognitive abilities and affective states using these different inventories. Of course, we will record the behavioral responses, and we will also use the electroencephalogram to analyze the electrical activity associated with the humor processing. And we will also implement the face reader software that will allow us to detect specific facial configuration that are associated with the Duchenne smile. This project will include 3 sub-projects. So in project 1, we will test which features of humor information influence humor processing in adolescents on the autism spectrum. In project 2, we ask whether cognitive strategies that are involved in humor processing are similar or different from those involved in other cognitive functions. And finally, in project 3, we ask whether a specific humor program might improve the well-being of these individuals. So I briefly present the task and the paradigm that we are at the moment building. So in project 1, as I said, we want to we will extensively investigate the neurocognitive and behavioral responses associated with the processing of different types of humor. So the main aim is to test which aspect of humor most appeal to and amuse adolescents on the autism spectrum. So to this, for this reason, we will test a verbal humor in a visual narrative, and we will also test a special type of humor that we call autistic related humor, in which we will present different memes depicting a special type of humor that actually amuse these people. And actually we found these memes online. And of course, we adapted that to make them suitable for research, but we also started from them. So we really wanted to use this stimuli in order to present a type of humor that can be very similar to those that they are used to appreciate. And based on the results of this project 1, we will build a humor profile that then will be used for adapting the humor program in the project 3. So every participant will have their own specific training. In the project 2, we will compare the neurocognitive processing involving humor and the one involved in other cognitive functions, such as insight, problem solving, divergent thinking, and mentalizing. So we think that the comparison between among these cognitive functions will clarify the nature of cognitive mechanism involved in processing humor in individuals on the autism spectrum. And finally, we will also present a project, the project 3, in which we will present this humor training program. And it's important to highlight that in this case, no strategies or technique for understanding humor information will be taught during the training. Instead, the humor training program will consist of being exposed to the humor information that we found was the most appreciated by the autistic individuals in Project 1. And specifically, this training will be a modification of the 7 Humor Habits program by Mackie, and will be conducted with the same autistic individuals of Project 1. In addition, before, during, and after the training, we will assess the well-being of the participants by using psychological assessment, of course, but also with the EEG task, in which we present pictures and situations depicting a different emotional balance. So in conclusion, this project will challenge these conventional assumptions about the cognitive functioning of individuals on the autism spectrum, and specifically about humor. And to do that, we will implement this participatory approach, a dimensional approach, and we will also develop an individualized humor program. So we strongly believe that actually the results of this project might have an impact then on the clinical practice and hopefully also on the educational context, also because we will also test, of course, neurotypical adolescents. So before I conclude, I also want to briefly present the results of a very recent review about humor as an emotional regulation strategy. So in this review, we actually analyzed the previous results about humor as an emotional regulation strategies, and we found that individuals with autism have often difficulties in emotional regulation, including reduced use of adaptive strategies, such as cognitive reprisal, for example, reliance on avoidance and repetitive behaviors. And we also found that several studies actually highlight that humor can function as a selective regulatory resource. In fact, individuals who use humor show lower anxiety level. And we also found that humor-based intervention, even though in a more classical way, show promising effects. Indeed, they show a reduction of depressive symptoms and also improvement in the social and emotional function. So these results are just confirming that actually humor is not absent, can be selective in autism and context dependent, but might be an important, meaningful resource that can support their well-being and also their social interactions. So to conclude, I think it's pretty clear that humor is a very rich domain for investigating how human brain integrates cognition and emotion. So humor is not just a distraction from serious things, but is actually a very complex and intelligent form adaptation that adds to both interpret the world and also to engage with the complexity. So with this, I want to first thank my team here in Zurich, and of course, all of you for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer your question or receive your input.